The wind in Itoro was always dusty. Every morning, it swept through the small rural town, carrying the smell of red sand, tired sweat, and firewood. Life in Itoro was simple, but for Abeni, life had also become a mountain too steep to climb. She was a mother of 5, a woman whose back was bent more by burden than by age. Her husband, Beo, once strong and lively, now coughed through the nights, wrapped in a thin blanket, too weak to rise. He had been ill for nearly a year. And with no money for proper medicine, he was slowly fading like a candle in harmattan wind. Every day, Abeni woke before dawn to sweep, fetch water, cook watery porridge, and chase her children to school with promises of better days. But each evening, she returned home with empty hands and a heavier heart. Her debts to the food woman, the landlord, and even the neighborhood Okada rider were growing like a weed no hoe could cut. People in Itoro had begun to whisper. That Abeni, always borrowing. Can't she just accept her fate? But Abeni did not stop trying. She refused to let her children sleep hungry, no matter how many insults she had to swallow during the day. A smell in the wind. It was one blazing afternoon when it happened. Abeni had been walking along the roadside, a warm basket of overripe bananas on her head. She had planned to sell them in the nearby market, but no one had bought even one. Tired, she stopped near the junction by the old shrine, the place people usually avoided. But something caught her attention, a smell, thick and warm, dancing in the wind like music. Puff puff. The golden smell of fried dough, soft on the inside, crispy on the outside, slightly sweet. The scent made her stomach twist. She hadn't eaten all day. She turned, and saw the sauce, a small puff-puff stall, hidden partly by shadows, placed at the edge of the junction. Behind it stood an old woman, her grey headscarf tied low, hands moving with graceful speed over hot oil. There was a small crowd, all licking fingers and smiling. Abeni, drawn by hunger and curiosity, stepped forward. The woman called Mama F. She approached the stall. The woman looked up, her eyes were sharp, but kind. "One puff-puff, please," Abeni said, digging into the fold of her wrapper for the single coin she had. The woman handed her a warm, round ball. Abeni bit into it. It was perfect. Soft. Warm. Fluffy. A taste that made her eyes water. Not just from hunger, but because it felt like something made with love. Or maybe magic. "Mama," she said, "please, who taught you how to make this?" The old woman raised an eyebrow. "Why?" "Because I want to learn. Please. I'll do anything. I have 5 children. My husband is sick. There's no food in our house. I swear by the gods, I am not lazy. Just please teach me." The woman was silent for a long moment. Then she sighed. "Come back when the sun has gone down. Come alone. Tonight." "Yes. If you truly want to learn, it must be at night. Not before. Not after. A deal in the dark." That evening, Abeni came. The road to the junction was darker than usual. No moon, no stars. Just the quiet sounds of insects, and her own fast heartbeat. She carried nothing with her, only hope and fear in equal amounts. The stall was still there. But the crowd was gone. Mama F stood beside a small black pot, glowing faintly from underneath. It smelled of puff-puff, but also something else. Something older. "You came," she said without turning. "Yes, Mama." "Then listen carefully. This is not just cooking. This is a gift and a burden. If I teach you, you must promise one thing: you will only ever fry these puff-puffs at night. After midnight. No earlier." Abeni hesitated. The night. Who would buy food at that time? But she nodded. She had no choice. I agree. The woman's face broke into a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Good. Then watch closely. Learning the way. That night, Ebony stayed with Mama F until the cock crowed. She learned how to mix the batter with a certain rhythm, how to speak soft words as it rose, how to heat the oil until it shimmered like river glass. The old woman showed her how to use the black pot, explaining that it never dried, no matter how much oil was used. It was strange. Magical. But Ebony didn't question it. All she saw was the chance to feed her children. When dawn came, the old woman gave her the pot, a bag of flour, and one last instruction. Do not eat it. And do not feed your family with it. It is not for your blood. Why? Ebony asked. Because it was made from something that does not serve you. That is all I will say. The first night. The next night, Ebony set up her stall beside her compound wall. The pot shimmered as she poured in the flour mixture, the oil bubbling calmly. At first, there was silence. But then she saw them. Figures. People. But not people. They came in silence. No footsteps. Their faces were unclear, like shadows wrapped in white cloth. They lined up one by one. Each picked a puff-puff. Each dropped a coin, cold, strange, and quiet. None spoke. None blinked. And then, they were gone. Ebony's hands shook as she counted the money. It was more than she ever made in a week. And in the morning, new customers came. A business is born. Ebony kept her word. Every night, she cooked only after midnight. Every morning, she cleaned the stall and sold what remained to the living. Within a week, people began to talk. Ebony's puff-puff is soft like clouds. Where did she learn to fry like this? Even the chief's wife sent her house girl to buy some. Soon, her debts were paid. Her children wore shoes again. Her husband's cough softened. And Ebony began to smile again. But deep inside her heart, something whispered. Who are your customers, Ebony? And what is the real price of this food? Ebony's life changed faster than a river flood in rainy season. Within 1 month of frying puff-puff at midnight, the woman who once borrowed salt and firewood from neighbors now had customers lining up before sunrise. Men in suits, women in wrappers, schoolchildren with satchels, all came to her stall. Her puff-puff was soft like cotton, warm like morning sun, sweet like rain on a dry day. People began to call her Madam Puff-Puff. She laughed when she heard it, but deep inside, her heart remained watchful. Because only she knew what happened after dark. The business grows. As the days passed, the coins in her house multiplied. Her husband, Beo, started to get stronger. The children began to eat full meals, yam with egusi soup, rice with stew, even chicken on Sundays. The landlord, who once hissed when he saw her, now greeted her with smiles. Ebony, your hand is truly blessed, he said one morning. Where did you learn this magic? She only smiled and replied. It's God's favor. But Ebony knew the truth. The pot from Mama F had never stopped bubbling. No matter how many puff-puffs she made, the oil never dried. It was bottomless, like a secret that kept feeding itself. Soon, she rented a second stall. Then a third. She hired 2 young girls from the next village to help her sell during the day. Every night, she still fried the puff-puff alone, after midnight, just as she was told. And every night, they came. The night crowd. They never knocked. They never spoke. But the moment the oil was hot and the first puff-puff dropped, they would appear. One by one. They were all white, not the white of joy, but the white of burial cloth. Their faces were blurred, like mist over water. Their hands were cold when they handed her coins. Coins that never made a sound. No jingle. No ring. Just silence. They took the puff-puff, ate it slowly, and left without looking back. When Ebony swept her stall in the morning, the ground was always covered with crumbs, strange, powdery crumbs that didn't attract ants. Still, she didn't ask questions. She remembered Mama F's warning. Do not eat it. Do not feed your blood. And she obeyed. Mama F disappears. One evening, Ebony went back to the junction, the same place she met Mama F. The stall was gone. The wooden bench, the little firepot, even the footprints, all gone like mist after morning sun. No one had seen her. No one had heard her leave. She asked around. Mama F. That old puff-puff woman. We haven't seen her for weeks. She just vanished. Oh. Maybe she traveled. But Ebony knew. Mama F hadn't traveled. She had disappeared. Just like a secret that had finished its work. The cravings. Some nights, the puff-puff smelled so sweet, Ebony almost reached for one. Just a taste, she told herself. One bite. But then she would hear it, a soundless whisper. And she would pull her hand back. Even when her children cried. Mama, just one puff-puff. Please. She would smile, shake her head, and hand them plain bread instead. This one is not for you, she said softly. They didn't understand. But they obeyed. Because in their mother's eyes, they saw fear that no sugar could sweeten. Baba Leke watches. One night, long after the midnight crowd had gone, an old man stood across the street. His wrapper was tied loosely around his waist. His walking stick tapped gently on the ground. His eyes were sharp, too sharp for a man his age. This was Baba Leke, the village herbalist. Some called him mad. Others called him wise. Children feared him. Adults respected him. He spoke little, but when he did, even the wind listened. He watched Ebony as she cleaned her pot. He didn't speak. He just stood there, his white beard glowing faintly in the moonlight. Ebony saw him. Their eyes met. He nodded once, then walked away. The next morning, he sent her a message. Come to my compound. We must talk. The visit. Ebony arrived at Baba Leke's home with shaky steps. His compound was filled with herbs, animal skulls, and bottles of colored liquid. Birds perched in corners. Smoke rose from a small fire. Baba Leke sat under a mango tree, chewing bitter cola. He looked up. Sit, my daughter. She obeyed. I have watched you. He paused. I see what others do not see. Ebony swallowed. I don't understand. Hush. You do. The pot you use, it's not ordinary. She stayed quiet. The coins they pay you with, do they sing? She shook her head. Do they shine? She shook her head again. Baba Leke sighed. They are not coins of the living. And those who eat your puff-puff, their joy will turn to ashes. Tears filled her eyes. I never meant harm. I was only trying to survive. I know, he said softly. But you must make a choice, Ebony. She looked up. Which choice? Continue, and you may gain riches. But your bloodline will pay. He pointed to her chest. Your children. Your husband. Your name. Ebony's voice cracked. But I have nothing else. Baba Leke looked at her with eyes that had seen too much. Then you must decide what kind of wealth you truly want. That night, Ebony returned home and stared at the pot. It sat there, black and shining, full of oil that never burned. She touched it. It was warm. But it didn't feel like fire. It felt like something alive. That night, she didn't fry anything. She sat by the pot, waiting, listening. And when the ghost came, they stood in silence. One of them, taller than the rest, stepped forward and placed a coin on the table. Ebony didn't move. He just whispered, "Not tonight." The ghost paused. Then, it vanished. And so did the others. The wind grew still. And in the silence, Ebony began to cry, the pastor who saw the dead. The village of Itoro had never known peace like this before. Every morning, people rose early, gathered outside Ebony's store, and waited for the first batch of puff-puff. Children sang her praises. Market women swore by her door. Some said Ebony's puff-puff could cure sadness. But not everyone believed the sweetness was natural. Far away, in the hills beyond the river, a traveling prophet named Pastor Daimeji was on a journey. Known across many towns for his gift of sight, he could see the invisible and hear the voices others could not. Some called him mad, others called him God-sent. He had walked barefoot for days, led by a strange pull in his spirit. When he reached Itoro, he felt it immediately, a heaviness in the air, like smoke that had no fire. Something was wrong. Arrival of the prophet. Pastor Daimeji arrived in Itoro wearing a white robe, carrying only a wooden staff and a small Bible with a leather strap. His face was lean, his eyes bright, and his lips never stopped whispering prayers. The villagers welcomed him politely. They were used to prophets passing through. He asked for a small room to rest. One of the elders offered him a mat in the town hall. But when he entered the village fully, his steps slowed. He could feel it. "There is darkness here," he whispered. A vision after prayer. That night, Pastor Daimeji attended a midnight vigil at the local church. They prayed with oil, danced with drums, and called on heaven to protect their town. When the service ended near 2 a.m., the streets were quiet. The stars hung low, and the air was thick. He decided to walk home instead of being escorted. That's when he saw it. From a distance, just before the turn to the main road, he saw Ebony's store. And what stood before it made his knees buckle. Dozens of figures. They were white, not with joy, but with death. Their faces were hidden beneath thin veils. Their hands were long, cold, and moved like they belonged to another world. They picked puff-puff from her table, placed silent coins, and ate slowly. Not a single word. Not a single blink. Ebony stood calmly behind the table, frying more, her eyes empty. She was not possessed, but she was part of it. The prophet gasped. He fell to his knees behind a tree and began to pray with trembling lips. "Jehovah. Jehovah Nissi. Father, open the eyes of this town." He watched them vanish, one by one, disappearing into the shadows like smoke. When the last one left, a chill ran through the wind, and the pot stopped bubbling. He knew what he had to do. The warning. The next morning, Pastor Daimeji stood in the village square with his staff in hand. He raised his voice. "Brothers and sisters of Itoro, a darkness lives among you." People turned, curious. "There is a woman who cooks food at night, not for man, but for spirits. And you eat the leftovers in the morning." Whispers spread like fire. "Who? Is it true? What spirits? What leftovers?" Then someone asked directly. "Who are you talking about, Pastor?" He turned slowly and pointed. "Ebony." Gasps. The same Ebony who helped the widow down the road. The same Ebony who paid school fees for orphans. Surely not. Ebony denies. By the time word reached Ebony, she was already preparing her stall for the day. People gathered around her. "Ebony, the prophet says you feed us cursed food. He said you cook for ghosts." She looked at them with wide, innocent eyes. "Me? Ghost. I am a mother of 5. I only sell puff puff to feed my family. Her voice broke with emotion. Have I not helped you all? Didn't I give free puff puff during the festival? Didn't I donate to the widow's burial? Now you call me a witch? Tears rolled down her cheeks. She grabbed her youngest child and lifted him. Look at my son. Does he look like a witch's child? The crowd murmured. Someone said, maybe the prophet is wrong. Maybe he's just trying to cause trouble. Another added, he just came yesterday and already is attacking our own. The people began to turn. The village splits. The village elders called a meeting. Some believed the pastor. Others believed Abeni. After hours of argument, they agreed. If the prophet has proof, let him show it. Otherwise, let him be silent. Pastor Daimeji did not fight back. He only said, they will see soon enough. A silent night. That night, Pastor Daimeji could not sleep. He fasted. He prayed. He begged God to cleanse the village. He lit candles and poured anointing oil in a circle around him. But the wind that night was not normal. It whistled. It cried. It whispered. And somewhere outside, something moved. Something ancient. The attack. In the early hours before dawn, a scream rang through the village. People rushed to the town hall. They found Pastor Daimeji collapsed on the ground, his eyes wide open but empty. His mouth was open, but no sound came out. He was blind. And mute. The prophet who saw the dead could now see nothing. The man who warned the people could now say nothing. Only the wind seemed to laugh. And far away, in her home, Abeni lit a candle beside her magical pot and closed her eyes. The child and the curse. The days in Aitoro were still hot. The mornings were still busy. And Abeni's puff puff stall still had a long line of hungry customers each day. Even after Pastor Daimeji went blind and mute, people kept eating. Even after the whispers. Even after the strange dreams some villagers had begun to report, dreams of shadowy figures, oily hands, and the smell of fried dough in the graveyard. They dismissed it. It's only dreams. The man was lying. Her puff puff is still the best. But in Abeni's house, the pot no longer sang. It hummed. And that hum carried something dark, something that made the hairs on her neck stand. She should have stopped. She should have walked away. But how do you throw away the same thing that fed your children, healed your husband, built your home? How do you betray the blessing that saved you? The forgotten rule. Abeni had always followed Mama F's rule. Do not eat it. And do not feed your blood. She obeyed, strictly. But on that morning, something changed. She had been up all night. Her eyes were tired. Her body was sore. And the children were hungry. The yams weren't ready, and the beans had burned. Her youngest child, Iriti, only 6 years old, wandered into the stall before dawn. His small feet padded across the floor as he searched for something to eat. On the tray lay just one leftover puff puff, golden and warm. Before Abeni could call out, he picked it. And took a bite. The collapse. Abeni turned around at the sound of his small cough. Iriti. No. But it was too late. The boy froze. His eyes widened. His mouth opened, and from it came no sound, only froth. He dropped to the floor, limbs jerking like a fish out of water. Abeni screamed. My son. My son. She grabbed him, shaking him, crying, calling his name. Iriti, answer me. Iriti, talk to me. But his lips no longer walked. His ears no longer heard. He stared at her, unblinking, mute and lost. The domino falls. Ebony wrapped him in a cloth and ran home. Her husband, Beo, rushed from the bedroom, panic in his eyes. What happened? Before she could speak, he grabbed his chest and staggered backward, gasping. He dropped like a tree. She screamed again. The neighbors came running. Call the herbalist. Call the healer. They came. They tried. But Beo was not the same man. His eyes were sunken. His breath shallow. He was alive, but barely. Before she could process it, the news came from the road. Her two older sons, on their way to school, had been hit by a truck while crossing the road. They survived, the neighbor said, but their legs are gone. Gone. One puff puff. One bite. That was all it took. The curse comes home. That night, Ebony sat alone beside the pot. Her son silent. Her husband broken. Her children scattered in pain. The pot bubbled. But this time, the oil looked darker. Thicker. Like blood. And then she heard it. Whispers. But not from outside. From inside the pot. You fed us. We gave you. Now you fed your own. She fell to her knees, sobbing. I didn't mean to. I followed the rules. But curses don't listen to tears. They listen to truth. And truth had arrived in Ebony's house. The village suffers. By the next day, the curse had spread. The first woman to fall ill was Momorong, a trader who bought 2 puff-puffs every morning. Then it was Tond, the mechanic. Then 3 schoolchildren. By sunset, over 10 villagers were sick, and none of the doctors knew why. Boils. Fevers. Hallucinations. Sudden madness. The chief called an emergency meeting. This is not normal, he said. We must find the root. And someone finally spoke up. We were warned. All eyes turned. The prophet. Daimeji. He told us. More voices joined. He said the food was cursed. He said she cooked for spirits. Then silence. Heavy. Hot. Final. Until one voice said. Bring Ebony. The confrontation. They came for her as she was closing her store. Not with anger. Not with rage. But with fear. And torches. She stepped into the village square, barefoot, her wrapper tied loose, her eyes swollen from crying. The chief stepped forward. Ebony. Daughter of Itoro. What have you done? Her lips trembled. She looked around, the same faces that once cheered her name. Now full of suspicion, fear, and sorrow. And she broke. I only wanted to feed my children, she whispered. I didn't know the price would be so high. What price? She looked up. Tears poured. My own son can't speak. My husband can't walk. My sons have lost their legs. Why? Because I fed them from the pot. Gasps. What pot? And she told them everything. Confession under the mango tree. It was early morning when the town bell rang. Not for celebration. Not for market. But for truth. The elders gathered in the square beneath the old mango tree, the one that had stood since their ancestors' time. People came from all corners of Itoro, whispering, wondering, waiting. At the center of it all sat Ebony. Barefoot. Dust on her wrapper. Her eyes hollow, but no longer afraid. She had nothing left to hide. Her son, Iriti, now mute. Her husband, Beo, bedridden. Her 2 sons, legs gone. Her stall, abandoned. The pot, still bubbling. The village waited. A heavy truth. Ebony stood slowly, leaning on a walking stick someone had handed her. The mango tree's wide branches cast a soft shade over her head, as though nature itself was listening. She raised her voice, not with pride, but with surrender. My name is Ebony. I am a mother of 5. And everything you heard is true. Gasps rippled through the crowd. I met a woman named Mama F at the old Shrine Road. She taught me how to make puff puff. But it came with a warning. She paused. Only fry at midnight. Never eat from the pot. Never feed my family. People shifted uneasily. Every night, customers came. But they were not from this world. They paid me with coins that never sang. They ate in silence. And I saw their leftovers in the morning. A baby began to cry somewhere in the crowd. A mother quickly hushed the child. I was poor. Hungry. Desperate. And the food brought us wealth. But I see now that it was never mine to keep. She raised her eyes, filled with tears. My son took one bite, and now he cannot speak. My husband cannot walk. My boys cannot run. And now you, my own people, suffer too. The air was heavy with silence. I am sorry. She dropped to her knees and placed the cursed black pot before the elders. It hissed, as if it knew the end was near. Fear and forgiveness. For a long time, no one spoke. Then, Baba Oletunji, the oldest elder, stepped forward. His beard was white as cotton, and his walking stick tapped like a heartbeat. He looked at Ebony. You brought darkness, yes. But you also brought truth. And truth, when confessed, is light. He raised his hand. Let her be forgiven. Some villagers hesitated. What about those who are sick? What about the children who died? Baba Oletunji nodded solemnly. Those are questions the gods must answer. But hatred will only bring more curses. Forgiveness is the only thing that breaks chains. And slowly, one by one, the people nodded. Not because the pain was gone, but because the truth had finally come. The return of the prophet. That evening, as the sun turned orange over the hills, a figure walked into the square. His robe was torn. His feet were dusty. But his eyes, they could see again. Pastor Daimeji had returned. He had spent 3 days and nights in the hills, fasting, praying, crying to the heavens. His voice had come back on the 3rd night. His sight had returned with the first rain. He had been broken. But now, he was restored. He stepped forward and placed his hands on Ebony's head. You have confessed. Now we will cleanse. The cleansing. The next morning, a ceremony was held by the riverbank. All the elders came. The villagers came. Even the sick came, carried by relatives, wrapped in cloth, leaning on sticks. The cursed black pot sat in the center, placed on a mat made of palm leaves. Pastor Daimeji lifted his staff. This pot has fed many, he said. But it fed from the mouths of the dead. It brought riches. But it drank sorrow. It is no longer welcome in our land. He raised his hand and prayed in a tongue only the ancestors knew. The wind grew strong. The water of the river stirred. Then, with a loud cry, 4 young men lifted the pot and threw it into the river. It sank. And the river grew still. The aftermath. Ebony returned home with nothing. No store. No money. No pot. But she felt free for the first time in years. The villagers, moved by her honesty and pain, began to help her. One gave her firewood. Another gave her yam seedlings. The tailor offered to sew her children's school uniforms. Pastor Daimeji visited her every week, praying for healing over Iriti and Baal. She now made real puff-puff, with borrowed oil, over a normal fire. Sales were slow. But they were clean. and each coin sang when it dropped in her hand. The moral. The story of Ebony spread far and wide. Travelers spoke of the woman who cooked for ghosts. Mothers told their children the tale before bedtime. And on the wall near the mango tree, someone carved the words, "What is gained in darkness will vanish in light." And so, the town healed. Slowly. But surely. And Ebony, though no longer rich, slept peacefully each night, knowing that even though the shadows had visited her, the light had stayed. The end.